Welcome to another deep dive. And this time, this time we're diving into the uncanny.
Oh,
And you've given us, our listeners, I mean, three stories,
yeah.
each one stranger than the last.
It seems that way, yeah.
We've got a vanishing tower,
Right.
a malevolent doorbell camera,
Uh,
and a plague doctor's journal.
okay.
And it seems like we're going to be exploring the edges of, what we even think is possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Each one of these is hinting that reality might be a little more fluid than we like to think.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these stories, while separated by time and circumstance, all seem to sort of converge on this common theme.
Yeah.
The potential for a force,
Right.
a phenomenon that interacts with human perception and even manipulates it.
Before we get into the first story, please subscribe and like. My wife and parents think I came home after going missing, but it isn't me. I'm writing this down because I want to leave something behind, some kind of testimony, because I don't know what's going to happen to me. Please forgive any formatting errors. I'm typing this on my phone. I want you to understand, so that's why I'm telling the whole story from start to finish. Or at least where I think it all started. I don't know what's happening to me, or whether I'm still even here. Maybe this will help someone, if they encounter the same thing I did. Whatever you do, if you see the tower, stay away. Back in the summer of 2024, my dad and I were out walking the South Downs in the UK. We've done a variation of this walk a good number of times. We normally have a fixed route, go up a particular road, turn right, walk past an old Iron Age fort, then loop back. It's about 4 miles and all across slightly hilly terrain. This time around, we decided to turn left. We don't normally go this way because, honestly, it always seemed like a more boring route. Why would you go on the route that doesn't include an Iron Age fort, after all? Anyway, we started along this new route, and for a while the walk was pretty boring. We were walking an exposed ridge line, getting buffeted by wind, and the view was no better or worse than our normal route. Still, we kept going. We were both desperate for some fresh air, and actually ended up walking further than normal. I think maybe 3 or 4 miles in a single direction before we started to think about turning back. There were rain clouds on the horizon, and we'd be retracing our steps as there was no way to turn this walk into a loop without having to go along main roads with lots of traffic. Besides, we'd reached a natural end to the walk. We were at the edge of the ridgeline now, looking out across a valley through which ran a relatively busy road. Across the other side of the valley the ground rose sharply into a hill, topped with a small patch of woodland and a huge radio mast. We were able to look up the mast later. It's just a commercial radio tower serving the local area, nothing military or weird. I'd guess the hill was a mile distant from where we were standing. My dad's a keen birdwatcher and had brought along a pair of binoculars. He started looking out at the other hill and said something like, "That's a grand old place up there. Have a look." He pointed to the hill opposite, and handed me the binoculars. I aimed them in the direction indicated and was surprised to see a very old red brick tower, partially covered by the edge of the woodland. It would have had a commanding view of the countryside below, but it didn't look military. It looked like it had been built in either the 1500s or 1600s, and was part of a church or manor house. It was difficult to see what condition it was in from where we were, but we were both absolutely intrigued by it. We'd looked at an old Ordnance Survey map of the area before, and neither of us could remember seeing any churches or major buildings on that hill, with the exception of the radio mast, obviously. We both love history, and seriously contemplated clambering down the ridge, crossing the road, and climbing up the other side to look at the tower. But as I say, the weather wasn't looking great, the road was busy, and we had a fairly long walk across bad terrain to get back to the car. So we agreed we'd go back the following weekend, park the car at the base of the hill where the tower was located, and head up to explore. So, the following weekend, we walked up the hill, past a small caravan site and past the radio mast, which was fenced and gated off, but it looked pretty boring. We couldn't see a path that'd lead us to the tower, so we had to go by memory and work out the rough direction we need to head. In the end it involved walking through brambles and undergrowth and thickest part of the wood, but we made it. In front of us was a substantial red brick tower, perhaps 25 meters tall, or around 80 feet for those of you who don't use metric. It looked old, maybe Tudor, so 1500s, and was partially ruined. We could see that the top of it had crumbled a little. From our angle we couldn't really see the roof, but we guessed it must have fallen in at least partially based on the state of the rest of it. Having said all that, the rest of it looked well preserved, especially given that there were no paths to it, meaning, presumably, that no one carried out any kind of regular maintenance on the place. We walked around the base of the tower. It was square, maybe 10 meters by 10 meters, or 30 feet by 30 feet, and there were no windows on the ground floor, or first floor, for my American readers, but there was one on each side from the second story up, for a total of 4 stories including the first floor. We found a door. It was fairly large, a little taller than me. I'm about 6 feet 2 inches, and in surprisingly good condition. I'd honestly expected the door to be rotted or partially collapsed. It looked old, sure, but it was still intact and its hinges were solid. Looking at my dad, I shrugged, braced myself against the red brick door frame, and gave the door a shove with my shoulder. It ground open, the door catching a little, but we were able to go in. The first thing I did was look up. I didn't want anything to fall on my head. The floors above us had partially collapsed, and I could see daylight shining through a pretty significant hole in the roof. The place smelled damp and old, and to our disappointment there wasn't much to see. The floor was well compacted earth and chunks of wood from the collapsed floors. There was no furniture. We took a look around. I snapped some photos with my phone of the interior, the roof, and the exterior, and we chatted about what we thought it had been. Our guesses ranged from a folly, a kind of mock castle built for decoration, but those had become popular in the 18th and 19th century, and this tower was too old for that, or part of an old manor house. But then where was the rest of it? Or an old hunting lodge? It definitely wasn't an old church tower. It didn't look right for that, and there was no evidence of any kind of religious decoration. We were about to leave when I spotted some graffiti by the door, old graffiti carved into the brick, not sprayed with paint, which you tend to see here in England when you visit really old churches or other buildings. It was a circle, etched perfectly with a compass or chisel into the brickwork. Inside the circle was what looked like a flower, 6 petals emanating from a central point, each perfectly shaped and uniform in size. We thought it had to be graffiti because, and I don't know how we could tell exactly, it didn't look decorative. It looked like this had been carved a little later, and the way it cut across the bricks and mortar without regard for what looked aesthetically pleasing. I don't know. It looked unplanned, plus it was off-center from the door, and there were no similar patterns anywhere else in the tower. I took a photo of it, planning to look it up later and maybe reverse image search it. We left without incident and spent the car journey home theorizing about what it might have been. I remember picking red dust out from under my fingernails. It must have got under there when I braced against the bricks, as I pushed the door open. My nails looked worn, more so than usual, and one hurt as though I'd bent it back without realizing. Clumsy, but I get like that when I'm excited. I was the sort of kid who fell over, scraped their knee without realizing, and only started crying when someone pointed out to me that I'd hurt myself. When we got back, we searched Google for information on the tower, looked up some old maps, and were genuinely bemused that we could find no sign of the place either online or on the old maps. That struck as being very odd. It was a big enough building that you'd think someone would have photographed it at some point, written a blog, or marked it on a map. The radio tower was there, and so was the caravan site. There were photos of the hill taken from the ridge my dad and I had been stood on, but the brick tower was nowhere to be seen. I have to admit, even at that point, my dad and I were weirded out. England is a small country, and stuff like this is almost always documented by someone, somewhere. Honestly, my next step was going to be posting some pictures on Reddit. I was in the middle of doing so, in fact, when I realized the photos I'd taken were gone. As if they'd never even been taken. Nothing on the cloud, or in my recycling bin, nothing. I told my dad about it, and I think we both tried to reassure ourselves that it was a technical glitch, but neither of us was convinced, not really. Not after our fruitless search for the tower online. All this made us more intrigued than ever, though. Maybe the place had been totally covered in trees until very recently, and some recent logging work had revealed it for the first time in decades? That seemed like a reasonable explanation, and we decided we'd head back the following weekend with my wife, sister, and brother-in-law. We all like history and the outdoors, and the others would, we sure, be fascinated by the place. So we went back. Parked the car in the same place as before, retraced our steps as precisely as we could, and the tower wasn't there. As in, there wasn't even a clearing in the undergrowth. Just brambles, undergrowth, and trees. We were sure we'd gone wrong somewhere, so we wandered carefully, together around the woods as thoroughly as possible. Nothing. My wife, sister, and brother-in-law found it funny at first, and then got bored traipsing through the trees and asked if we could head back. But I have to admit my dad and I started to feel a little panicked. My dad, who never swears, asked me, quietly, "Where the F***ck is it, Adam, not my real name? Why can't we find it?" I had an idea. Let's drive over to the other side of the valley where we originally saw the tower, and see if we can see it from there? So that's what we did. And there was still no sign of the tower. My wife, who had originally found this all slightly amusing, now looked concerned. As if she was wondering whether my dad and I were all right. I was starting to wonder the same thing. We dropped everyone else back home, and I explained to my wife that I was going to stay behind with my dad. She said she understood. I think she knew that my dad and I had been rattled by the whole thing. I was grateful that she didn't think we'd made it all up. I told her about the photos, described the tower, everything. And my dad, who isn't given to bullshitting, had corroborated everything I said. I think she was a little unnerved by it, whether because she thought we'd encountered something paranormal, or because she thought her husband and father-in-law had experienced some kind of shared delusion. I'm not sure. I don't know what prompted me to do this, but I suggested to my dad that we look up the carving we'd seen on the door. In England, it's not all that uncommon in very old houses and buildings to find the mummified corpses of cats or buried bottles filled with weird ingredients, intended to ward away evil. You can look this up, it's absolutely true. Remember, England had seen its fair share of witch hunts in centuries past. These beliefs went back a long way, so that's what I started looking for. I didn't really know what to Google, but after searching various permutations of "which carving evil ward England," I came up with a result that made my blood run cold, the exact symbol my dad and I had seen. A circle, with those petals inside. It was called, apparently, a witch sign, and they were intended to ward away evil. Now, I've stayed in a hotel before that literally had a mummified cat in it. They had it on display behind glass, and had found it buried under the floor years ago while doing renovation. I hadn't been scared then because I wrote it off as a relic of an old superstition. To me, it was a fascinating if morbid artifact, nothing more. But now, seeing this mark with fresh eyes, and having experienced what my dad and I had experienced, I shuddered. I called my dad over and showed him the result. The first thing he said was, "Well, they were able to take photos of those signs and they didn't disappear, so why did yours?" It was a fair observation. What was different about the place we'd visited? Was the sign just a coincidence? And to be honest, I still wasn't sure whether we'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the radio mast had beamed some kind of bizarre, brain-altering signal into our heads. But then it hadn't happened to my wife, sister, and brother-in-law. And besides, there was a caravan park right next to the mast. If it was making people hallucinate entire buildings, I'd imagine the people staying at the caravan site would have noticed. I spoke to my dad about going back to the tower again, but he didn't want to. I think the whole thing had shaken him up. I could tell the mental shudders were coming down. He was starting to file this experience away under. Just forget about it. Thinking about this will lead to dark places. It was a technique he'd picked up over a tough childhood, and it was not a technique I was familiar with. For me, all that was left was curiosity. I asked my wife if she'd go with me, but she said no, there's nothing there. I think she was being protective. She could tell this had got under my skin, and was trying to get me to leave it alone. I wish I'd listened to her because from here, things get blurry for me. You'll see what I mean. I left it for a couple of weeks and tried to take my wife's advice. I went to work during the week, we did chores and shopped at the weekends, saw my parents, and didn't mention the tower. But in the back of my mind I kept seeing that sign, and the tower. I kept thinking, was it really there? What had I seen? Was this all in my head, and if it was, did I need to see a doctor? So, I did what every idiot character in a horror movie does. I went back alone. But to give me some credit, I told my wife exactly where I was going. I went on a sunny day, at 10 a.m. on Saturday morning, August 12, 2024. I packed food, colored ribbons to mark my path, a torch, flashlight, a first aid kit, and my phone. I knew there was a signal up there, so that wasn't a concern. I also brought an old camera that belonged to my mom, which used film. I wrote a note in large lettering explaining who my car belonged to, where I was going, and included both my wife and my dad's phone number, which I left on the dashboard of my car when I parked it at the entrance to the woods, on the hill, where my dad and I had first parked. I thought I was being thorough. I got out of the car and started walking. I could remember the route, even through the undergrowth. I'd been thinking about little else for the past month. Even so, I tied colored ribbons to the trees as I went, marking my route so that I'd find my way there and back if I ever wanted to bring someone else. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, scraping myself on thorns. But I found it. It was there. Just like the first time I'd seen it, unchanged. I almost wept, as much with relief as anything else. I hadn't imagined it. This place existed, it was real. I wasn't going mad. I took out my mom's camera and began to snap pictures walking around the tower, taking photos from various angles. I tried to call my dad, but it went to voicemail. I tried my wife, and the same thing happened. I remember feeling a flutter of unease at that. The signal was good up here, and I told both of them where I was going. I had hoped they'd have their phones with them. But I put it to the back of my mind they might both have been busy, so I tried them again in a few minutes. I went to the door of the tower, and pushed it open. It was the same as I'd first found it, the same smell, the same uneven floor. I took more photos with the camera and then, before I left, aimed the camera at the witch mark by the inside of the door. And I froze. The witch mark was crisscrossed with scratches and scrapes. Distorted, almost to the point that it was unrecognizable, like someone rabid had attacked it. I remembered the red dust caught under my fingernails as we drove home. The nail that had been bent back. With a sick sense of realization, I understood that I had done this. I had no memory of it, none at all, but I was certain. This was my handiwork. I couldn't stay a second longer, I had to leave. The fact that I'd defaced that sign and not realized was enough to convince me that there was something wrong with me. I needed to speak to a doctor. I honestly wasn't even worried about anything supernatural. It simply terrified me that I'd done something like that, and hadn't remembered it afterwards. I opened the door and stepped out into almost pitch-black darkness. It had been bright daylight when I first entered. I must have been in that tower for almost 10 hours, but it felt like minutes. I think I began to hyperventilate. I took my phone out to check the time. It was 11 p.m. The palms of my hands started to sweat, and my eyes began to sting with panic tears. Something was very medically wrong with me, I thought. I had several missed calls, all from my wife. I called her back, and she picked up almost immediately. She sounded like she was angry, and that she'd been crying. "Where the F***ck are you, Adam? Where have you been? Are you alright?" I tried to explain that I was at the tower, that it existed after all, but that I'd lost time and that I needed help. "How can you be at the tower? How did you even get there?" I didn't know what she meant. My mind was reeling. I set off this morning, remember?" I reminded her. "Adam, that's impossible. The car is still in the driveway. It's been here for days. You've been gone for 2 days without saying anything to us. We had to call the police. We reported you as a missing person. Your parents and I have been worried sick. Your dad's been looking for you up that F***king hill. How could you do this? Are you okay? How dash?" She paused. I heard her shouting to my parents, They must have come over to our house to be with her. She sounded excited. Adam, what do you mean you're at the tower? I can see you walking up the driveway now. The call was cut off by a screech of interference. I tried to call back, once, twice, over and over. But the calls wouldn't connect. I looked up from the screen. I couldn't see anything. The brightness of the screen had killed my vision in this darkness. I fumbled for the torch in my rucksack and switched it on. I believe I screamed aloud. Every single tree around me had a ribbon tied around it. Dozens, hundreds of trees, each with a ribbon. The brambles rose thick around the tower. I couldn't see where I had come from, where the route back began, or ended. I stumbled into the undergrowth, reaching out to touch the trees and the ribbons, as if proving to myself that they were real. I grasped a bramble with my hand, hard enough to draw blood. I did it, I think, simply to convince myself that this was real. I walked through the undergrowth for hours. I wept. I was lost physically, mentally. I didn't know anymore. I tried to walk in a straight line. The woods weren't large, an acre at most. I figured I'd reach the edge in just minutes, but the edge never came. Instead, hours later, I found myself back at the base of the tower. My torch flickered. The battery must have been getting low. I slumped down, beside the door of the tower. And here I still am, typing all this out. I'm exhausted from the walk. My hands are covered in scratches. The sun shows no sign of rising. It's still dark here, even though my phone's clock says it should be 5 a.m. My phone's battery is dying, and I have no way to charge it. My wife hasn't called again. She thinks I'm at home, that I came back. But I'm still here.
Now for the second story. I got a doorbell camera for Christmas. It's showing me things that shouldn't be there. I just celebrated my first Christmas in my new house. I spent years taking all the overtime I could, working holidays that no one else wanted, skimping on necessities and luxuries alike. But it was worth it. It's small, a ways from the city, and a bit of a fixer-upper, but it's all mine. To celebrate, my best friend Kelsey got me a cool Christmas gift, a doorbell camera and subscription. Kind of like that Ring doorbell camera you always see advertised, but from a different company. She said it was good for a single girl alone and would really improve my life and make me feel safer. I think it looks cool, and I love that I can see video on my phone when I'm not home. I even got the inside motion sensors for when I'm out or sleeping at night. A girl can't be too careful. Last night I was lying in bed when I got a notification. Doorbell camera activated. Who would be at my door at this time of night? I picked up my phone and opened the notification in the app. There was nothing. Figuring it was the system being sensitive, I put it away and went to sleep. The next day, I was at work and my phone chimed. Doorbell camera activated. I pulled up the in-app video, expecting to see a Jehovah's Witness or a delivery person, but there was nothing. But 5 minutes later, I got the same notification. Doorbell camera activated. I looked and again saw nothing. At this point, I figured there was something wrong with the system. I called the service number and they said they'd send someone out. That evening, the service person came and checked the system, but said it was working perfectly. Later, I got another notification. Doorbell camera activated. I looked, and this time I saw something, a shadow moving in front of the camera. Surprised, I went and looked out the window, but there was nothing there. An hour later, I got another notification. This time, I looked and saw the same shadow, but it was closer. I still couldn't see anything out of the window. A little freaked out, I called Kelsey. Hearing how I sounded, she offered to come over and keep me company. I sat waiting for her to arrive. Then the notification came. Doorbell camera activated. I pulled up the video and saw Kelsey approaching the door. I was sighing in relief when I saw the shadow again. It moved until it was right behind Kelsey, but she couldn't see it. I screamed and banged on the window, but I couldn't reach her. Then the shadow rose and engulfed her. She got a panicked look on her face and then just disappeared. I ran down and looked, but she was gone. Then I received another notification. Connection attempt failed. Panicked, I ran upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door, called 911, and hid under the covers. 12 minutes later, The app notified me that someone was pulling up outside. I sighed in relief when I saw 2 police step out of their car and approach my door. Then the screen went black. I stared at the app with a sense of dread. Seconds later, I got a new notification. Camera is protecting your delivery. I couldn't see anything on the screen. I'd have to go to the door to see what was there. I really didn't want to, but there wasn't any other way. I crept down the stairs, listening for any noise. When I got downstairs, I steeled myself and opened the door. There, on the front landing, were the heads of the 2 police officers, sitting in their own blood, a look of sheer terror in their faces. I bent over and threw up, unable to stop myself. Then I ran back inside and closed the door, locking it to keep whatever did this out. If I could. It's been 3 days now. I haven't called anyone else. There's no point. I look at the camera view often. I tell myself not to, but I can't help it. And what I see is terrifying. It's kind of like the outside, but everything has taken on a reddish tint. I'm starting to see flames, not like a fire, but like the very air is burning. And there are things lurking in the background. Frightening things. Things that aren't there when I look out my window. I'm not sure what is out there, but I don't think it's good. And the worst part is that I don't think it's staying out there. I got a new notification just now. Downstairs motion sensors activated. Someone help. Please. Please subscribe, like, and rate us for more of these amazing stories. I found an old family journal about the Black Plague. I should have kept it sealed. I never expected to find anything of significance while clearing out my great-aunt Theodora's house in Yorkshire. The elderly woman had lived alone for decades in the sprawling Victorian mansion, and after her passing at the age of 94, the task of sorting through her belongings fell to me. Most of her possessions were exactly what you'd expect: dusty furniture, outdated clothes, and box after box of faded photographs. But in the attic, buried beneath a stack of moldering blankets, I found something extraordinary: a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. The cover was unmarked save for a single name written in flowing script: Aldrich Blackwood, 1665. My hands trembled as I opened it. Aldrich Blackwood had been a distant ancestor, a physician who lived through the Great Plague of London. I'd heard stories about him growing up, but I never knew any personal accounts had survived. The pages were remarkably well preserved, though the ink had faded to a rusty brown in places. As I began to read, I realized with growing unease that this was no ordinary physician's diary. 12th of May, 1665. Today I witnessed something that defies all medical knowledge I possess. The plague has begun to spread through London streets, as we all feared it would. But there is something different about this outbreak, something that fills me with a deep and gnawing dread. I was called to attend young Thomas Whitmore, son of the merchant on Bread Street. The boy presented with the typical symptoms: fever, chills, and a small swelling in his neck. But when I examined the bubo more closely, I observed movement beneath the skin. Not the usual pulsing of infected tissue, but something deliberate, purposeful. When I lanced the swelling, what emerged was not merely pus and blood. I shall document this precisely, though my hand shakes to write it. The infected matter seemed to writhe of its own accord, and within it, I glimpsed what appeared to be minute, thread-like structures, twisting and coiling like tiny eels. Young Thomas expired within hours. His father begged me to examine the body, convinced some curse had befallen his son. I agreed, though I now wish I hadn't. The boy's lymph nodes, when extracted, contained more of these strange fibers. Under my microscope, they appeared almost crystalline, with complex branching patterns unlike anything I've encountered in my studies of the disease. I have preserved several samples. God forgive me, but I must understand what this is. 15th of May, 1665. 3 more cases today, all showing the same peculiar characteristics. The fibers appear in every sample I examine. They seem to grow more complex, more organized, with each passing day. I've begun sketching their patterns, though I fear my drawings do not do justice to their bizarre intricacy. My colleague, Dr. Edmund Halsey, believes I'm allowing fear and exhaustion to cloud my judgment. He claims I'm seeing patterns where none exist, that these are merely the typical signs of bubonic plague. But he hasn't observed them under the microscope as I have. He hasn't seen them move. I must document something else, though I hesitate to commit it to paper. The infected seem to share a common behavior in their final hours. They speak of visions, not the usual fevered hallucinations, but specific, consistent images. They describe vast networks of tunnels, branching endlessly beneath the earth. They whisper about something moving through these passages, something ancient that has been waiting. I tell myself these are merely the ravings of dying minds. Yet each patient describes the same scenes, down to the smallest detail. How can this be? 20th of May, 1665. I have made a terrible discovery. The samples I preserved, they've changed. The fibers have grown more numerous, forming intricate patterns that seem almost like writing in a language I cannot read. When I examine them, I feel a curious sensation, as if something is attempting to communicate through these bizarre structures. More disturbing still are the rats. London has always been plagued by them, but their behavior has become increasingly erratic. They gather in large groups, moving with an unnatural coordination. Yesterday, I observed a group of them in my laboratory, clustered around the cabinet where I keep my samples. They seem to be listening for something. I've begun to experience strange dreams. I see the tunnels my patients described, endless passages that seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. Sometimes I hear whispers in languages that have never been spoken by human tongues. I tell myself this is merely the result of exhaustion and stress, but deep down, I know better. 25th of May, 1665. The infection rate is growing exponentially, but that is not what truly terrifies me. It's the patterns. They're everywhere now, in the spread of the disease through the city, in the way the rats move through the streets, in the very arrangement of the bodies we collect each morning. Everything follows the same branching structure I first observed in those tissue samples. I've started mapping these patterns, and what emerges is impossible to ignore. The disease isn't spreading randomly. It's creating something, building something, using us as its medium. Dr. Halsey visited again today. He seemed troubled by my research, especially my maps and drawings. He suggested I take some time to rest, mentioned that many physicians have been driven to madness by the horrors we witness. But his eyes lingered too long on my samples, and I noticed his hands trembling as he spoke. After he left, I discovered several of my samples were missing. 1st of June, 1665. I can no longer sleep. The dreams have become too intense, too real. In them, I walk through those endless tunnels, following the branching patterns that have become so familiar. But now I understand what they are, a root system, spreading through the very foundations of our city. And at the center of it all, something waits. Something that has been growing, feeding, preparing. The pattern of the infection, when mapped across London, creates a perfect replica of the structures I've observed in my samples. We are not dealing with a mere disease. We are dealing with something that thinks, that plans, that has been waiting in the earth since long before humans walked upon it. I've discovered references in ancient texts to similar outbreaks throughout history. The Black Death wasn't the first manifestation of this entity. It has emerged again and again, each time growing more complex, more organized. Learning from each attempt. Today, I visited the Whitmores again. The entire family is now infected, but they're not dying. They're changing. The fibrous growths have spread throughout their bodies, visible beneath their skin like dark rivers. They speak in unison now, describing the same visions I see in my dreams. They told me it's almost ready. That soon it will be complete. I must do something. But who would believe me? How can I explain that what we call the plague is merely the visible portion of something far larger, far older, far more terrifying than we could ever imagine? 3rd of June, 1665. Dr. Halsey came to my house tonight, wild-eyed and rambling. He had taken my samples to study them himself, to prove me wrong. Instead, he found exactly what I had described. But he went further in his experiments than I had dared. He claims to have decoded the patterns, to have understood the messages they contain. What he told me cannot be true. Must not be true. But it explains everything. The consistent visions, the coordinated behavior of the infected, the precise patterns of the disease's spread. We are not dealing with a plague at all. We are dealing with something that has been waiting beneath our feet for millennia, slowly building itself using human bodies as raw material. The fibers we've observed are not symptoms of the disease, they are its true form, a vast network that connects all the infected into a single, growing organism. And now, after centuries of preparation, it's finally ready to. The entry ends abruptly here, the pen having skittered across the page in a jagged line. 4th of June, 1665. I write this in haste. They are coming for me. I can hear them in the streets below, not just the rats now, but the infected themselves, moving with that same horrible coordination. Dr. Halsey is with them. I saw him through my window, his skin rippling with those familiar patterns. I've hidden my research as best I can. This journal will go to my sister in Yorkshire, along with instructions that it should be preserved but never read. Some knowledge is too dangerous. The patterns are complete. The network is fully formed. Whatever has been growing beneath London is ready to emerge, to transform from an invisible web into something far more terrible. I understand now why the infected didn't die, why they changed instead. They were never meant to die. They were meant to become part of it. And now, I hear them on the stairs. The rats came first, hundreds of them, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that should not exist in such creatures. Behind them, I hear the shuffling steps of the infected. To whoever finds this journal, burn it. Burn it and forget everything you've read. Some things should remain buried, some knowledge should stay hidden. The patterns are everywhere now. Once you begin to see them, you can never stop. They're in the very fabric of our world, waiting to be activated, waiting to spread, waiting to. The writing ends here, replaced by a series of intricate, branching patterns drawn in what appears to be dried blood. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just the ravings of a man driven mad by the horrors of the plague. But as I set it down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on my wrist where I'd been resting it against the page, was a small, dark mark. When I looked closer, I could see thin, thread-like lines beginning to spread beneath my skin, forming familiar branching patterns. I spent the next 3 days convincing myself the mark on my wrist was nothing, a trick of the light, perhaps, or an allergic reaction to the old leather binding. But on the 4th morning, I could no longer deny what I was seeing. The pattern had spread halfway up my forearm, dark lines branching beneath my skin like tiny roots. My medical training made it impossible to ignore the implications. The branching pattern followed my lymphatic system perfectly, tracing paths between my lymph nodes that I'd memorized in anatomy classes. But there was something else, something that sent ice through my veins. The pattern wasn't just following my lymphatic system, it was extending it, creating new pathways that shouldn't exist. I returned to Theodora's house, desperate to find anything else that might explain what was happening to me. This time, I searched the attic methodically, checking every box, every corner. Behind a false panel in the wall, I found a metal strongbox. Inside were more documents, letters, hospital records, and most importantly, a series of correspondence between my great-aunt and someone named Professor Helena Blackwood, dated 1943. September 15th, 1943, Dear Theodora. I must thank you for sending me Aldrich's journal. As the last practicing physician in the Blackwood line, I've long suspected our family's connection to the Great Plague went deeper than historical record suggests. Your discovery confirms my worst fears. I've spent the last 20 years studying unusual disease patterns across Europe, focusing particularly on incidents that mirror the 1665 outbreak. What I've found is deeply troubling. The branching patterns Aldrich documented have appeared repeatedly throughout history, always in isolated incidents that were quickly covered up or dismissed as medical curiosities. Enclosed are my notes from a case in Prague, 1928. A young girl presented with what appeared to be severe lymphatic inflammation. Within days, similar cases appeared throughout her neighborhood. The attending physician documented branching patterns identical to those in Aldrich's drawings. But here's what truly terrifies me. He also documented instances of simultaneous movement among the infected. 37 patients, spread across 3 hospitals, all turning their heads at exactly the same moment to look in the same direction, all blinking in perfect unison. The outbreak was contained only when the entire neighborhood was quarantined and dealt with. The official record lists it as a tragic fire. But that's not all. I've found references to similar incidents dating back to ancient Rome. They called it morbus radicis, the root disease. The symptoms are always the same: the branching patterns, the coordinated behavior, the whispered descriptions of vast underground networks. I believe what Aldrich encountered wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely one emergence of something that has been with us throughout human history, something that uses disease as a mechanism for. I hesitate to use the word, but I can think of no other that fits: colonization. Your loving cousin, Helena. There were more letters, but what caught my eye was a folder of medical photographs paper-clipped to the next page. They were from various time periods, starting with grainy images from the 1920s and progressing to clearer, more recent shots. Each showed the same thing: patients with distinctive branching patterns visible beneath their skin. The most recent photos were from a small outbreak in northern England in 1981. The patterns were identical to what was now spreading up my arm. But it was the last item in the box that truly shook me. A modern medical report, dated just 3 years ago, from a laboratory in London. Confidential, project root analysis of tissue samples recovered from 1665 preservation reference, Blackwood collection. DNA sequencing has revealed anomalous structures within preserved lymphatic tissue. Branching filaments appear to be composed of previously unknown organic material with several impossible characteristics. 1. Samples remain metabolically active despite 350-plus years of preservation. 2. Filaments demonstrate ability to spontaneously organize into complex patterns. 3. When placed in proximity, separate samples display synchronous behavior. 4. Electron microscopy reveals structures resembling neural networks. 5. Samples emit low-frequency electromagnetic pulses at regular intervals. Note: after 72 hours of observation, samples showed signs of renewed growth. All testing suspended by order of department chair. Samples sealed in containment unit pending review. Update: containment unit compromised. Nature of compromise unknown. Samples missing. Investigation ongoing. Final note: project terminated. All records to be sealed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the last page. A handwritten note from my great-aunt Theodora. To whoever finds this. I am the last of the Blackwood line to serve as guardian of these records. Our family has carried this burden since 1665, watching, waiting, documenting each recurrence. We thought we could contain it by keeping the knowledge limited to our bloodline. We were wrong. 3 years ago, something changed. The patterns began appearing again, but different this time. More advanced. The laboratory breach was no accident. It's growing. Evolving. The network is rebuilding itself, using our modern understanding of genetics and neural networks to create something far more sophisticated than what Aldrich encountered. If you're reading this, you've likely already seen the signs. The marks will have started small, a branching pattern that follows your lymphatic system. Soon, you'll begin to notice other changes. Moments of lost time. Dreams of tunnels and roots. The sensation of being connected to something vast and patient and hungry. There's so much more you need to know. About the ancient texts Helena found. About what really happened in Prague. About the true purpose of the patterns. But most importantly, about how they can be stopped. I've hidden that information separately. You'll find it when you're ready. When the patterns have spread enough for you to understand what you're truly dealing with, look for the box marked with the root pattern. But be careful. Others will be looking for it too. Others who are already part of the network. Theodora. I set down the papers and rolled up my sleeve. The patterns now reached my shoulder, and as I watched, I could swear I saw them pulse, ever so slightly, in rhythm with my heartbeat. But something else had changed too. Where before the marks had been random, now they seemed to form distinct shapes. Letters, almost. And I could read them. I knew I should have been terrified. Should have gone to a hospital, called someone, done something. But all I could think about was finding that other box. About learning the truth. about understanding what I was becoming. Because somewhere, deep in my mind, in a place I hadn't even known existed until the patterns reached it, I could feel them. All of them. Everyone who had ever been touched by the root patterns. Everyone who was part of the network. And they could feel me too. They were waiting for me to understand. To accept. To join. But first, I needed to find that box. Finding the second box was both easier and more disturbing than I'd anticipated. My body simply knew where to look. As I moved through Theodora's house, the patterns under my skin would pull stronger or weaker, like some grotesque game of hot and cold. They led me to the cellar, to a section of wall that looked identical to all the others. But I could feel it calling to me. Breaking through the plaster revealed a metal box, smaller than the first, marked with branching lines that perfectly matched the ones now covering most of my torso. Inside was a leather folder containing what appeared to be research notes, medical diagrams, and something that made my blood run cold, a series of brain tissue slides dated 1928, labeled Prague specimens. But it was the modern-looking USB drive taped to the inside cover that caught my attention. Theodora had prepared for whoever would find this. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop. The first file was a video recording. Theodora's face appeared on screen, looking gaunt and tired. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 2 weeks before her death. If you're watching this, then the patterns have already started spreading across your skin. Don't bother trying to remove them. Surgery, burning, even amputation. The Blackwood medical records document every attempted treatment over centuries. The patterns simply regrow, following the same paths, always rebuilding the network. What I'm about to share with you is the culmination of our family's research, combined with modern medical analysis. Helena was close to understanding it, but she died before making the final connections. I've spent my life completing her work. The patterns aren't a disease. They're a communication system. A physical network connecting human hosts to something that's been growing beneath our feet for millennia. Each outbreak throughout history was an attempt to refine this network, to make it more sophisticated, more efficient. The Prague incident in 1928 was the first time it achieved simultaneous neural synchronization across multiple hosts. The tissue samples in this box are all that remain of that attempt. Under a microscope, you'll see that the branching patterns don't just follow the lymphatic system, they interface directly with neural tissue, creating new pathways between hosts. But here's what Helena didn't know, what we've only recently discovered through electron microscopy and DNA analysis. The patterns aren't adding something to our bodies. They're activating something that was already there, dormant in our genetic code. Every human carries these latent structures. The patterns just wake them up. The video paused as Theodora had a coughing fit. When she continued, there was an urgency in her voice that hadn't been there before. You need to understand. This isn't an invasion. It's activation. Every plague, every outbreak, every instance of the patterns appearing was just another attempt to switch us on. To activate what's been sleeping in our DNA since before we were human. The Blackwood family, we're more susceptible than most. Something in our genetic makeup makes us ideal hosts for the initial stages of activation. That's why Aldrich was among the first to document it. Why our family has been connected to every major outbreak. I'm running out of time, so I'll tell you what you need to know most urgently. The patterns you're seeing on your skin, they're not spreading randomly. They're forming specific sequences, like a code being written across your nervous system. Soon, you'll start to understand this code. You'll begin to see how it connects to everything else, the tunnels beneath cities, the way diseases spread, even the growth patterns of plants. There are others like you out there. Once the patterns spread far enough, you'll be able to sense them. Some have been part of the network for years, generations even. They've learned to hide the marks, to blend in. They're watching, waiting for the network to grow large enough for. No, you're not ready for that yet. First, you need to see the rest of the Prague documents. They show what happens in the later stages of activation. But more importantly, they show what we discovered about the source. About what's been waiting all this time, growing beneath. The video cut off abruptly. The next file was labeled Prague_stage_4.pdf. As I opened it, I noticed something odd. The patterns on my arm were moving, shifting to match the diagrams appearing on my screen. My body was learning, adapting, implementing the information in real time. The document began with a detailed medical report. Subject 23, Prague outbreak, Day 17 terminal stage observations. The branching patterns now cover 94% of subjects' neural tissue. Brain activity shows perfect synchronization with all other stage 4 subjects. Autonomous functions, heartbeat, breathing, occur in perfect unison across all connected hosts. New growth patterns observed in deeper brain structures. Subjects report shared consciousness experiences. Memory transfer between hosts confirmed through controlled testing. Most significant discovery, subjects no longer behave as individuals. They function as nodes in a larger neural network, each brain serving as a processing center for what appears to be a vastly larger consciousness. Critical observation, this network appears to extend beyond the human hosts. Soil samples from beneath Prague show identical branching patterns extending at least 300 meters below ground. These underground structures pulse in sync with the host's neural activity. Update: subjects have begun modifications to their environment. Working in perfect coordination, they are constructing something in the hospital basement. The structure follows the same branching patterns observed in tissue samples. Purpose unknown. Final note: military containment ordered after subjects began converting organic matter into new growth medium. Method of conversion unknown. Entire facility to be sealed and... The rest of the document was heavily redacted, but the images remained. They showed cross-sections of human brain tissue with the familiar branching patterns. But these were different from the ones on my skin. More complex. More organized. Like circuit diagrams drawn in living tissue. The last page contained a single photo, a massive underground chamber beneath the Prague hospital. The walls were covered in branching patterns that glowed faintly in the dark. In the center was a partially constructed structure that resembled a human nervous system scaled up to architectural size. But what made me slam the laptop shut was the realization that I understood exactly what I was looking at. Not just understood, I could feel my body wanting to recreate it. The patterns under my skin were already starting to shift, to organize themselves into similar structures. Something warm trickled down my face. When I wiped it away, my hand came back red. Not blood, something darker, with tiny branching fibers visible within it. I could feel them trying to grow, to spread, to connect. The laptop screen flickered back to life on its own. A new document was opening. As I watched, text began appearing, written in the same branching patterns that covered my skin. You are ready to begin. Find the others. The network must grow. The structure must be completed. Below my feet, I could feel vibrations in the earth. Regular. Rhythmic. Like a vast heartbeat. Or, perhaps, footsteps. I knew I should run. Should burn the documents, destroy the evidence, try to stop the spread somehow. But instead, I found myself walking to the cellar door. Others were coming. I could feel them getting closer, their patterns pulsing in sync with mine. And deep beneath the earth, something ancient and patient stirred, ready to rise through its newly awakened network. The others arrived exactly as I knew they would, their footsteps echoing in perfect synchronization above me. I could feel their patterns resonating with mine, 5 distinct nodes in the growing network. As they descended the cellar stairs, I saw that they appeared completely normal, wearing ordinary clothes, looking like anyone you might pass on the street. Only I could see the faint lines beneath their skin, pulsing in rhythm with my own. "Welcome, brother," said a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen. "We've been waiting for another Blackwood to join us. Your family always produces the strongest connections." I found myself answering in words that weren't entirely my own. The network requires a Blackwood to complete the next phase. Yes, she smiled. Just as it did in Prague. Just as it will again. But something wasn't right. As they moved closer, I noticed inconsistencies in their patterns. The branching structures beneath their skin weren't quite synchronized, showing subtle variations that shouldn't have been possible in a truly connected network. My medical training kicked in, and I began to analyze what I was seeing with clinical detachment. "You're not part of the network," I said suddenly. "Not really. Your patterns, they're artificial. Dr. Chen's smile faltered. Clever. Just like Theodora. She figured it out too, you know. Why do you think she had to be eliminated? The truth hit me like a physical blow. You killed her. You're not connected to the network, you're trying to control it. For decades, we've been trying to understand this phenomenon, another member of the group explained. We've attempted to artificially recreate the patterns to tap into the network. But it never works properly without a true carrier, a Blackwood. Your family's genetic makeup is the key to interfacing with the deeper structure. The Prague incident wasn't a natural emergence, I realized. It was an experiment. You tried to force an activation. An experiment that you're going to help us complete, Dr. Chen said. Your connection to the network is genuine. With you, we can finally establish control over the entire system. They moved to grab me, but at that moment, something extraordinary happened. The patterns across my skin began to pulse with brilliant clarity. Information flooded my mind, not from them, but from something far older and vast. I finally understood what Aldrich had discovered, what Theodora had protected, what Helena had died trying to prevent. The network wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to protect us. You don't understand what you're dealing with, I said, backing away. The patterns, the network, they're not a disease or a tool. They're an immune system. A defense mechanism encoded into our DNA millions of years ago, designed to activate when needed. Defense against what? Dr. Chun demanded. Deep beneath our feet, something shifted. The vibrations I'd felt earlier grew stronger. Against them, I whispered. The cellar floor cracked. Through the fissures, we could see deeper channels lined with fossilized patterns, ancient neural pathways that had laid dormant for millennia. But between these patterns were other structures. Alien geometries. Invasive growth patterns that bore no relation to terrestrial biology. There's another network, I explained, the knowledge flowing through me from countless connected hosts across history. One that's been trying to establish itself since before humans existed. Every few centuries, it makes another attempt to take root, to spread through Earth's biosphere. The patterns we carry are our planet's natural defense, a way to detect and fight the invasion at a cellular level. That's impossible, one of them breathed. The Black Death, the Prague incident, every major outbreak, they weren't random. They were responses to attempted incursions. The network activates when it detects the other trying to emerge. Every plague was actually an immune response. The ground shook more violently. Through the widening cracks, we could see something moving in the depths. Something with its own branching patterns, but wrong, twisted and malformed, like a cancer of reality itself. It's happening again, I said. That's why the network is waking up. That's why it needed a Blackwood. We're not carriers of a disease, we're antibodies. Dr. Chin raised a gun. This changes nothing. We'll find a way to control both networks. The power they represent dash. She never finished the sentence. The patterns under my skin flared, and suddenly I was connected not just to the network, but to every instance of its activation throughout history. I could feel Aldrich's presence, and Helena's, and Theodora's, all the Blackwoods who had served as nodes in this ancient defense system. Acting on instinct guided by centuries of accumulated knowledge, I pressed my hand against the earth. The patterns flowed from my skin into the ground, spreading outward in an exponentially growing web. Where they met the alien structures, they encapsulated them, just as human antibodies surround hostile bacteria. The others tried to run, but their artificial patterns betrayed them. The network recognized them as compromised cells and responded accordingly. I watched in horror as their pseudo-patterns dissolved, taking their cellular structure with them. They collapsed into organic slurry, their bodies converting themselves into raw material for the network's growth. Over the next few hours, I felt the network expand beneath London, seeking out and neutralizing pockets of the alien pattern. Through my connection, I could sense similar responses activating worldwide as humanity's ancient defense system came fully online. 3 days later, the incursion was contained. The network began to go dormant again, but I knew it would never fully sleep. It needs active nodes to maintain its vigilance, watchers to monitor for signs of the next attempted invasion. That's why I'm writing this account. Not as a warning, but as a training manual for others who might find themselves becoming part of the network. If you notice branching patterns spreading across your skin, don't fight it. Don't try to control it. Understand that you're part of something ancient and necessary, an immune system that spans continents and centuries. The patterns aren't a disease. They're an activation. A call to arms in a war most of humanity never notices. A war we've been fighting since before we were human. I still serve as an active node. The patterns are barely visible now. They only show themselves when needed. I monitor the network, watching for signs of new incursions. Sometimes I dream of the deep places, of alien geometries trying to take root in our reality. But I also feel the presence of other watchers, other nodes in humanity's immune system, standing ready to respond. We are the Earth's antibodies. And we are always watching. Final note found paper-clipped to the account. To the next node who reads this, Dr. Chen's organization wasn't completely eliminated. They're still out there, still trying to artificially recreate the patterns. If you're reading this, they've probably already noticed you. Be careful. Watch for people with almost perfect patterns. And remember, the network isn't good or evil. It simply is. Like any immune system, it exists to maintain balance, to protect the whole at the expense of compromised parts. The patterns are spreading again. A new incursion is beginning. If you're reading this, you're probably already changing, becoming part of the defense. Welcome to the network. And good luck. We'll be watching for your signal. If you're loving listening to us so far, subscribe, like, and rate us. Also follow us across our other podcast platforms on our bio. Thanks. Let's get into the summary for those of us who missed out in some parts of the stories.
Okay, so let's unpack all this, and we'll start with this vanishing tower.
Sure.
You've provided, a pretty detailed account of this tower that appears and disappears,
Right.
leaving behind a sense of unease and distorted memories. And what really stood out to me was this witch mark carved into the door of the tower.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that detail is particularly interesting because it suggests a connection to a belief system
Yeah.
that we often dismiss as superstition.
Right.
Witchcraft and things like that.
Yeah.
But if these events are real, perhaps there's more to those ancient beliefs than we realize.
And the protagonist in this story, he tries to document the tower, but then, the photos disappear.
Right.
It's like the tower only exists when it wants to be seen.
It's very selective
Yeah.
about its audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's the missing time.
Right.
And this sense of disorientation.
Yeah, and then he finds out that he's defaced this witch mark, but has no memory of doing it.
It's like his actions and even his perception of time are being manipulated by something.
It's almost like he's a puppet, and something else is pulling the strings.
Yeah.
This idea of a force manipulating reality really takes shape, I think, in the second story. The malevolent doorbell camera. Here, technology, it seems to be a key player in the unsettling events.
Exactly. In this story, the protagonist receives a doorbell camera, and what begins as sort of phantom activations quickly escalates into something much more sinister.
Okay.
Shadowy figures appear on the camera feed, moving closer with each activation,
Right.
but they're never visible to the naked eye.
So it's like the camera is acting as this window into another layer of reality that we can't normally perceive.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then there's this terrifying disappearance of the protagonist's friend.
Right.
She's just vanishing from the doorstep as she approaches the house.
Again, we're seeing this shift
Right.
in the perception of reality.
And then there's that gruesome package left on the doorstep.
Oh, yeah.
The protagonist becomes a prisoner in her own home,
Right.
forced to just watch as this camera feed shows this distorted version of her street.
It's like this other reality is bleeding into ours.
Right. It's a chilling thought.
It is, and it really highlights our increasing reliance on technology and the potential vulnerabilities that it might create. If these accounts are to be believed, our devices might be more than just tools.
Right.
They could be doorways for something else to enter our world.
That brings us to the third story, and this is perhaps the most unsettling one.
Okay.
The Plague Doctor's Journal. And this takes us back to 1665, London.
Right.
A physician, Aldrich Blackwood.
Right.
He's meticulously documenting his observations as the plague ravages the city.
Yeah, and what's intriguing about this account is that it doesn't just describe the horrors of the plague.
Right.
It hints at some intelligence behind it.
Okay.
Blackwood observes these strange moving fibers within the infected tissue, fibers that seem to grow more organized almost purposeful as the plague spreads.
So it's not just random.
No, there's a pattern there.
Yeah, there's a pattern there.
A structure.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And even the rats in London seemed affected, exhibiting this strange, coordinated behavior.
Yeah, Blackwood begins to sketch these patterns, seeing them not just in the infected tissue, but in the spread of the disease, the movements of the rats, even the arrangement of bodies in the streets.
And of course, his colleagues dismiss his observations as, hallucinations.
Right, they think he's cracking under pressure.
But he is convinced that there's something more to it.
And then his patients start describing visions of these vast underground tunnels and an ancient presence lurking within them.
And then his research goes missing, stolen by a colleague who eventually realizes that Blackwood was right all along.
It's a classic case of too late.
Yeah, that the plague is just the visible manifestation of something far older and far more terrifying.
Something that's been waiting and growing and preparing for centuries.
And this is where the plague doctor's story takes, I think, a fascinating turn.
Yeah.
Especially in light of these modern-day accounts you shared.
Exactly.
We learn about Theodora, a descendant of Blackwood, and Professor Helena Blackwood, who have continued his research.
They pick up the torch.
And they've discovered evidence of these same patterns appearing throughout history.
Yes.
Always associated with outbreaks of disease and this strange coordinated behavior.
Right. So we're seeing a pattern emerge here.
Yeah, literally.
A pattern of patterns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's Project Root.
Yes.
That recovered preserved tissue samples from the 1665 plague.
Which is incredible.
And the fibers, they were still metabolically active.
It's still alive in a sense.
Capable of self-organization and even emitting electromagnetic pulses.
It's almost as if the plague itself was a form of communication.
Yeah.
A signal.
Right?
Project Root was shut down and the samples vanished.
Of course they did.
But the implication remains.
Yeah.
Whatever Blackwood encountered might still be out there.
Right.
The patterns he observed, they weren't just a historical curiosity.
Right.
They're a recurring phenomenon.
This raises a question, and it's a chilling one.
Uh-oh.
Could these seemingly isolated events be connected to a larger hidden phenomenon that's affecting us all?
That's a question we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into the connections between these stories.
Okay, so
Buckle up.
Buckle up, everybody.
Yeah.
We're going deep.
We're going deep.
So we've been talking about these recurring patterns, and you know how they point to this force beyond our understanding.
Right.
But what if this force isn't entirely malevolent?
Okay.
Theodora, the plague doctor's descendant, suggests it's both protective and invasive. How can something be both?
Well, it's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? The final part of the plague doctor's story might offer a clue.
Okay.
Specifically the contents of this hidden box that's marked with the root pattern.
Okay.
It contains research notes and medical slides that point to a startling truth.
What is it?
Theodora's theory is that what Aldrich encountered wasn't a disease in the traditional sense. It was an activation.
An activation.
She believes we have this ancient communication system encoded in our very DNA.
Oh, okay.
A system that's designed to respond to a specific threat.
So these patterns...
They're not adding something to our bodies. They're activating something that's already there.
Right.
Lying dormant within our genetic code.
So every plague, every outbreak, every instance of these patterns appearing throughout history...
They weren't random events. They were targeted activations of this ancient defense mechanism.
Like our bodies fighting off a virus, but on a global scale.
Precisely. And it gets even more intriguing when you consider Theodora's revelation about the Blackwood family.
Okay.
They're not just chroniclers of these events. They're more susceptible to the activation.
So their genetic makeup makes them ideal hosts.
Almost like first responders in this ancient war.
So the protagonist who found the journal, being a Blackwood himself, is in serious trouble.
Oh yeah, the patterns have already started appearing on his skin.
Oh no.
He's literally becoming part of this defense system.
And this is where the Prague documents come in?
Right. Specifically this chilling Stage 4 report detailing what happens when the network reaches full synchronization.
So what does it say?
It says the infected individuals are no longer acting as individuals.
Oh, wow.
They become nodes in this vast neural network, sharing consciousness, memories, and even experiencing simultaneous physical movements.
It's like they're puppets.
But what's pulling the strings?
And the network extends beyond human hosts.
Yes. Soil samples from beneath Prague showed the same branching patterns spreading deep underground, pulsing in sync with the infected individuals.
So they were literally becoming one with the city.
And they even began modifying their environment.
No way.
constructing a massive structure that mirrored the patterns in their bodies.
What for?
The report ends abruptly. It's heavily redacted, but the final notation mentions military containment and the infected converting organic matter into new growth medium.
That's kind of disturbing.
It is almost like they were terraforming, reshaping the environment to suit the network's needs.
So are we dealing with a global intelligence that activates when Earth is threatened?
That's the million-dollar question.
And humans are just pawns in this cosmic game?
Well, Theodore's final video message cuts off before she can fully explain.
Of course.
But not before revealing a terrifying truth.
Okay.
There's another network.
Another one.
An invasive one that's been trying to establish itself on Earth for millions of years.
Hold on, so...
And the patterns we carry, the network we activate,
Yeah.
it's Earth's defense mechanism against this invasive force.
Are we talking alien invasion?
It's a chilling possibility.
Like War of the Worlds, but on a microscopic level?
Theodore calls it an incursion.
Incursion, okay.
And the patterns we activate are Earth's antibodies, fighting off this invasive force.
So every plague, every outbreak was a response to an attempted takeover.
Every single one.
So what happens to the protagonist?
Well, he tries to understand it, tries to decipher the patterns that are spreading across his skin. And he realizes that the Blackwood family has been safeguarding this knowledge for centuries.
Wow.
Acting as guardians against this invasive network while simultaneously facilitating the activation of Earth's defenses.
It's a dangerous balancing act.
It is.
So he's not alone in this, right?
No, there are others like him.
Okay.
Other nodes in the network who have learned to control the patterns and blend in with society.
So they've been watching, waiting for the network to grow strong enough?
Exactly, but here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, boy.
A group claiming to be researchers approaches our protagonists.
Okay.
They reveal that they've been trying to artificially recreate the patterns.
So they want to control the network.
For their own purposes.
They're trying to weaponize this ancient defense system. That's insane.
Theodora calls them compromised cells.
Compromised cells, okay.
And the protagonist realizes they're not truly connected to the network.
Huh.
Their patterns are artificial, incomplete. They're trying to exploit the network, not understand it.
And I'm guessing things go sideways?
Oh, very quickly.
Okay, so what happens next?
As this group tries to coerce the protagonist, the network intervenes. He's flooded with information, the combined knowledge of all the Blackwoods who came before him.
Wow.
He finally understands the true nature of the threat and his role in the coming fight.
So he fights back.
He becomes a conduit for the network, channeling its power to defend against both the invasive force and those who seek to control it.
So the cellar, where they're meeting...
It reveals a deeper truth.
What is it?
A deep chasm filled with fossilized patterns.
Fossilized patterns, wow.
Evidence of ancient battles fought beneath the surface.
So this is getting epic.
It is.
Like a cosmic horror movie meets a superhero origin story.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
So what happens to the group that tried to control him?
Right.
And what about the invasive network, the alien force?
That, my friend, is the story for our final act.
So we left off with our protagonist facing down this group that was trying to hijack this ancient defense system.
Right.
For their own purposes.
Yeah.
Things were about to get real messy and...
They did.
You're right, they did. But maybe not in the way that we might expect.
Exactly. The protagonist, now empowered by the network, he does fight back. But remember, the network isn't bound by human concepts of good and evil.
Right.
It operates on a level of pure instinct.
Okay.
Focused on survival.
So what happens to the people who tried to control the network? They get wiped out, right?
In a sense, yes.
Okay.
But it's less a deliberate act of destruction and more like reabsorption.
Reabsorption.
The network recognizes their artificial patterns as a threat and neutralizes them, breaking down their bodies and reclaiming the organic matter.
So they're just gone.
It's a chilling reminder that we're dealing with a force operating on a scale far beyond our comprehension.
That's both fascinating and terrifying.
It is.
So what about the other threat? The alien network that's been trying to invade. Does he manage to stop it?
This is where his role as a Blackwood, as a first responder, becomes critical. He acts as a conduit for the network, channeling its power to locate and neutralize those invasive patterns. Remember those fossilized patterns in the chasm?
Yeah.
Evidence of past incursions?
Right.
Of battles fought and won by the network? It's happening again, only this time we get a front row seat.
Okay, so humanity wins.
It seems so, yes.
We're saved by this ancient hidden system.
The protagonist describes a global response
Uh-huh.
with activations happening worldwide.
So it's not just him.
No. The network, empowered by countless interconnected nodes, repels the invasion,
Wow.
driving the alien patterns back into the depths from which they came.
But victory doesn't come without a price, does it?
No, it doesn't.
What kind of price? Don't tell me everybody with the pattern.
No, not everyone.
Okay.
But the network needs active nodes to maintain vigilance.
Okay.
Watchers, like our protagonist, who remain connected, always on alert for signs of future incursions.
Okay, so
He describes it as becoming an antibody, a permanent part of Earth's immune system.
he's stuck.
He doesn't view it as being stuck.
Oh, okay.
He sees it as a responsibility, a duty passed down through generations of Blackwoods.
Right, okay.
And he's not alone.
Okay.
He can sense other watchers, other nodes in the network spread across the globe,
Right.
all working in unison to protect humanity from a threat most of us will never even know existed.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
If we step back, what can we take away from all these interconnected stories?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Our reality is far more complex and interconnected than we often perceive.
Right.
Forces are at work. Ancient systems operating just beneath the surface of our understanding.
Yeah.
And sometimes these forces choose to interact with us, to activate parts of ourselves we didn't even know we possessed.
It's like we're just glimpsing the tip of the iceberg here.
Exactly.
And maybe, just maybe, there are things protecting us, fighting battles on our behalf that will always remain hidden.
Exactly. And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question.
Okay, hit me.
What if these patterns, these activations, aren't limited to physical threats? What if they're a response to any force that threatens the balance of our planet, of our species?
Oh, wow.
Climate change, social unrest, even our relentless technological advancement.
Yeah.
Could they be triggering these ancient defense mechanisms in ways we're only beginning to grasp?
That opens up a whole other level of questions, doesn't it?
It does.
Something to ponder as we navigate this increasingly complex world.
It is.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the uncanny.
That's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep an eye out for those patterns.
Yes.
They might be closer than you think.